Good morning, folks. Welcome back to day 2 of the West Virginia Trails Statewide Conference, and we're happy to have you back. I'm going to get you started here, and I'm going to pass it off to some folks to talk about trail planning in a second. But Kent and I talked yesterday afternoon, and we realized we didn't really outline everybody that's involved in this working group. And I put working group in parentheses because it's sometimes it's a collaborative, sometimes it's a coalition. We don't really have a solid name for it. Steering committee was also thrown out there a few times. But we do want to recognize Rails to Trails Conservancy, the National Park Service, Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance, the WVU Smith Outdoor Economic Development Collaborative, the WVU School of Public Health, West Virginia Connected Communities, Public Health Advocates, Friends of the Cheat, Mountain State Trail Alliance, Beckley Office of Outdoor Recreation and Economic Development, the West Virginia Horse Coalition, West Virginia Rails to Trails Council / the Mon River Trails Conservancy. So we have a whole host of folks who've been working on this for a long time, and the group has shrunk and the group has grown, but this is the solid organizers of your conference here. So if you see them around virtually, thank them. I'm going to stop my screen share for a minute here, and I just want to talk a little bit about yesterday, recap a little bit, and it was very validating for the West Virginia Trail organization in terms of numbers and levels of engagement that we saw. I like to keep my eye on the number of attendees as people come in and then people exit throughout the session. And generally, when I attend these types of things, you might see like 50 people start and maybe 20 people end by the end of the session. But our numbers stay consistent. We had started out with 140, I think, with the plenary session yesterday, and we had about that number in the end. So that's a big success in my book, just showing that the panelists and the presenters were providing relevant content to folks. But I mostly attribute that to the solid representation of the geographies and user types that people were talking about, in addition to the fact that we all have common challenges and opportunities across the state. So we were talking about common challenges, common issues all together. I found it particularly encouraging that we had about 40 mountain bikers, 25 hikers and backpackers, 30 rail trail users / bikers, hard service folks, 20 paddlers, and the small and mighty equine user group get together to show up at the networking meetings. We're not really sure how many people would actually attend those, but we got a great turnout there. And the biggest takeaway, I think, was that we can by working together, we can get more done than working individually, which is one of the main components of the West Virginia Trail organization. It really showed me that this group has a future in terms of conferences and organizing and really addressing some of these challenges and opportunities, particularly with developing the 3 points or 3 prongs or the triangle that Peter Harnick was talking about yesterday, with building that government support, building that local advocacy, and having the funding in place for future projects by working together. So this is how we can seize the upward trajectory that Secretary Ruby was talking about in terms of tourism, and really capitalizing on the quality and health and public health outcomes that are related to the West Virginia folks who are discovering the trails in their backyard. And honestly, I felt a little cliche. I think if you go on the West Virginia Trail website, you'll see something about building the trails movement in quotes. So I felt a little cheesy saying that, but now that I see everyone kind of organized and coming out and engaging, it's really validating and encouraging. I feel a little less cheesy, and it all feels a little bit more real that we are actually building the movement here. So thank you for your support. Share my screen back here. None of this would be possible without our sponsors, and we just want to recognize 2 sponsors today, AECOM and Downstream Strategies. Again, I encourage you to go check out their sponsor profile within the Whova app. And with that, so I guess you're asking, we have a group of people coming together and they're super enthusiastic about trails, but what's next? And the question of components of planning briefly came up in Peter's presentation yesterday. But here to give you a real in-depth answer is Rich Edwards and Jeremy Wimpy. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves because I know they wear multiple hats and they have lots of diverse experience, but I'm gonna kick it over to them at this point.
Thanks, Nathan. So yeah, My name is Richard Edwards, and I work for the Outdoor Recreation Development Collaborative of West Virginia University. And I'm the Outdoor Recreation Infrastructure Coordinator. And I'm not a West Virginia native, but I'm a West Virginia transplant. I was lucky enough to get married at Blackwater Falls over 20 years ago, and then immediately raced the 24 hours of Canaan the next day, and then spent a couple of years living in Slady Fork, West Virginia. Then spent the following couple of decades working for IMBA, the International Mountain Bicycling Association, both as trail care crew, and then helped found Trail Solutions and ended up becoming a director of Trail Solutions before I was given the awesome opportunity to come back to West Virginia and to work for WVU. The role I play at OEDC is similar to what I was doing at IMBA, which is assisting communities develop great trail systems that help transform those communities. And I believe that with outdoor recreation and the landscape and the amazing passion and talent I see in West Virginia today, we can truly transform the state through outdoor recreation. Along the way, I've interacted with a bunch of folks and worked with a bunch of different folks. And one of those is Dr. Jeremy Wimpy. And it's my pleasure to introduce him today. He's going to later in the presentation talk about a great success story that helped result from good planning in an adjacent state. So, Jeremy.
Thank you, Rich. As Rich said, my name is Jeremy Wimpy. I'm a planner and a trail designer with Applied Trails Research, and also wear a couple academic hats doing research on visitor use and visitor use planning and management in public lands. Really excited to be here today, calling in from your neighboring state in Virginia, your sibling state, but I've had many fond memories recreating in West Virginia, and also this year was able to work with Rich and his program on some planning work in Fayette County with the Fayette Trails Coalition. So super excited to be here and look forward to sharing some information later in the presentation.
So we're going to cover, we're going to do an overview of trail planning and how it leads to successful trails. This isn't going to be a DIY or a really in-depth presentation about planning. If you're interested in that, we'll talk later in the presentation about where you can get more information. We will have time for a Q&A at the end. If you want to, you can put questions in the chat. But if a lot of people put questions in the chat, we may lose track of those during the presentation. So you can also write them down and submit them at the end. Much of the content in this presentation was developed over the last 20 years working through IMBA. So we definitely owe a debt of gratitude to them. Some of the content you're going to see in here is come out of the Trail Solutions program and developed with that, and with assistance also from members of the Professional Trail Builders Association. And also want to, everybody who's attending this, thank you very much. The trails we have today and the trails we're going to have tomorrow are largely due to the efforts of folks like yourself. If we want to have the dream of making West Virginia be viewed as an outdoor recreation mecca like Western North Carolina or Colorado or Utah, it's going to be because of the good work that folks like yourselves do. So one of the changes in trail planning over the past couple of decades has been a shift from just providing access to outdoor open spaces to focusing on outcomes from outdoor recreation. That it's not just about providing trail experiences and access to outdoors, but what social outcomes, what management outcomes can be achieved through trail experiences, and where we route trails, where we put them, and the type of trails we provide. Specifically, we're going to talk about planning for quality trails. We want to have trails that are super successful. We want to have trails that are close to where people live. We want to have trails that are going to be compelling and encourage folks to get outside. We want trails that are going to inspire folks who currently aren't trail users to get outside and be on trails. That's what's really going to change our communities and help change our culture. Also, quality trails, if we want to reap the economic benefits of trails, we have to realize that we are in a bit of a competition with other communities around the Eastern US in terms of tourism, in terms of talent recruitment, and by providing high quality trail experiences that are renowned and well-known, we're going to compete well with those other places. And this is important because more and more, when we look at talent recruitment and staffing for companies, people are choosing where to live based on the outdoor recreation opportunities, based upon the quality of life. It's not purely about the trails. It's also about the appraised trail experience, the after trails experience. But places where you have all of that together, that's where folks want to move to. And then they're figuring out how to make a living after they get there. West Virginia can be one of those places. We're seeing a huge talent migration right now across the United States. And we stand poised to be able to take advantage of that talent migration and attract some of those folks here. How do we make a great trail community? There's a process here. These generally don't happen by accident. We want to create a vision. We want to identify what are the elements and the special things in that community that'll work within a trail system, what the special opportunities are based on the landscape and the market. Specifically, and this will be a theme throughout the presentation, we want to identify the return on investment for the community. A lot of people who make decisions about trails in terms of funding, land access, are community leaders, agency heads who may not be trail enthusiasts themselves. We need to make them understand how important trails are for a successful and healthy community outside of the fact that we just like to be on trails. The economic benefits, the health benefits, and then we need to put together a team. We call this the dream team. A variety of different stakeholders, different skill sets. And these dream teams, these are some of the skills or folks that will hold those skills that we want to have on there. Communication experts, people who know how to raise funds. We found in a lot of communities, financial advisors, local financial advisors are key people to have on your dream team. They know the right people in your community. You want to have folks from the land management agency representing both current or retired. The retired folks can give you great clues into how communication and operation strategies within land managers. It's good to have that back channel communication. If you're going to embrace diversity on your trail system, especially if you're in communities that have inequity in outdoor recreation, it's important to have representation from those communities as part of your team so that you can understand how you can make trails that are going to be relevant and work with them. Don't forget your local trail enthusiasts. And then remember your Chamber of Commerce. These are, again, folks who are going to be very interested in bettering their community and improving their community, but may not be trail enthusiasts. So how can we describe the trails and the trail outcomes in ways that are going to be relevant to them? What do we want to achieve with the vision that we paint for the trail system, the future vision? What do we want to have in that? What is the intended goal? Is this going to serve people in that community, improved quality of life, health opportunities? Is it going to create a tourism destination? Are you doing it specifically to do talent recruitment for a large employer that's having trouble recruiting people there? Are you looking for ways that you can improve health benefits? Those different ROIs, those returns are going to help determine which funding streams and which stakeholder support you're going to receive for your project. And then you need to create a brand to go along with this vision. This brand is going to help sell the trail idea, but then more importantly, it's going to help you market the trails and that destination once you've got it up and running. Most of the successful areas that have been really good at activating the trail systems have had a strong brand that's authentic and replicates that area and differentiates that area from a lot of others. Remember, we are in competition with places like Knoxville and Bentonville. Communicating that vision early on it's critical to have easy to understand documents that allow for folks to grasp the project, not get too confused, but then support it, whether it's through permission, whether it's through fundraising. And these images and these documents should be understandable by folks that are non-specialists, potentially not trail users. So if you'll see here, we've got in the upper right, we've got both a map and then representative pictures within that map that show the different types of trail experiences. Because when we all say trail, I'm sure that everybody on this call, when I say the word trail, the image that you have in your head is slightly different from everybody else. We have a wide diversity of trails. We'll talk about that a little bit later about the spectrum of trails, but having images is really effective to describe the specific experiences you're talking about. And the two lower ones, these are both renderings based on actual photos of a site with then drawings on top of them. These are not as-built, these are before the work was done, so that people can visualize what the experience, what the activity is going to be like once the project's completed. And this is critical to helping raise funds, get permission, and get support. Can't describe enough how important having good one-page images like this can be for moving projects forward. Oftentimes, the critical people who are making decisions may only consider your project for a few minutes before they say yes. And giving them the opportunity to have enough information to feel comfortable, but not so much information to get confused, is a powerful tool. We want to figure out, as we build support, we want to figure out key stakeholders, how they can help the project, and what the leverage points with those stakeholders are. What are their objectives and goals outside of trails? And how can we, with the trails, help them achieve their other goals? Whether that's the land manager, whether that's the local health agency, whether that's the Chamber of Commerce, if we can demonstrate to them that the future trails that we're planning will support their objectives and help them facilitate them, then they're going to go ahead and support the trail project. As we go through this process, there's a bit of a life cycle. We generally start with a feasibility or a concept plan, generally one or the other. Then we may move into a master plan, and then more specifically into design, and that'll lead us into construction. And then, very important, the last two here, operation and maintenance. It's critical to have a trail system set up when you do the trail planning to be prepared for that. And then the activation. We used to say, if you build it, they'll come, and they did. But we've seen places where they've done active activation, active programming around the trails, and the response is much better. And then we're not just tapping into the trail enthusiast community, we can create new trail users. I guarantee in West Virginia that the vast majority of potential trail users are that, they're potential. They're not currently active trail users. Many of our fellow citizens and residents of the state would become trail users if we gave them good, compelling opportunities in their backyards that had easy on-ramps. So we've, this is largely broken down into our planning and then our design and construction side. We've got our feasibility, our concept, our master plans up top. And then we have contracting. Contracting applies to all of this. Applies to whether we're doing a feasibility study or a concept plan, you're probably hiring a professional to do that. Same with your design development and then your construction. And then you may even be contracting somebody for operation. So contracting is part of the whole process, but we stuck it in the middle for here. And we're gonna cover each one of these in a little bit more detail, but just to give you an idea of the basic timeline. So during the feasibility or the concept phase, and feasibility is generally if you've got multiple properties or you really don't know what's going to work, or if that's what the agency that's providing the funding wants to see as a feasibility study that you compare to alternative options. The concept phase is mostly you've already identified a certain area. And you're pretty sure that you've got a good opportunity and you want to determine what it is. So what's the demand? What kind of trail are you going to put? What kind of trail system are you considering? And what impact do you want? And how does that tie in with the market demand? Do you, we know in West Virginia, one of our big gaps with trails is entry-level trails near where people live. We have super challenging trails in the backcountry, and we have a lot of them. What we don't have is where a lot of the people live in the state is trails where they can easily access them. We also know, and Snowshoe's tapped in this really well, that we have a pretty extensive market 2 to 3 hours away that we can tap into. And if we provide really compelling trails, niche trails of a unique type, people will travel 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to come to those trails. So feasibility plan, these are generally zone-based. Some of them, if they may have corridor analysis as well, especially if some of the properties are very small or have difficult property boundaries. It may be necessary to get down to the corridor level to see if it's viable. But these are both, and you may, during the feasibility, they may grade the areas based upon the desirability of them for trails. So again, looking at multiple zones and seeing what's possible. Concept plans, I've already identified an area, and then looking at that area and determining what are the best opportunities in that area, which parts of that landscape work best for what types of trails. These are what we would call a zone-based plan, where it's we're not worrying so much about specific trail corridors, more that we're identifying this section of the property is good for this type of trail. This section of the property is where the trailhead's going to be in the campground. So next to that, we want to have the skills area, and then we want to have some easier trail. And this terrain over here isn't really suitable for shared use trail, but it would work great for a hiking only trail. So we can have some hiking only zones. These are all zoned out estimates and mileage that are possible. And then we get some cost opinions out of this. At the concept level, these are very round figures and oftentimes in ranges, because at this point, there's a significant amount of unknowns in the project. And the more unknowns you have, the more flexible you want your cost opinions to be. And these concept plans are marketing plans. As I mentioned before, these are the things that help you get approval to move forward with your project, to get the funding you need to move the design, to attach to your grant application. Easy to understand, demonstrates the different type of experiences that might be provided. This one here takes in this property already had existing trails, so those are shown up on there. And some of the new trails are drawn in, but it's still broken down into a zone fashion. Master plan takes it to the next step. This is corridor based and ground truth corridors, where the zones, these corridors on the concept plans may be based more on desktop analysis and a little bit of field review, but not possibly ground truth the whole way. When we move to the master plan, generally these are ground truth the whole way, though we are talking about corridors, not necessarily the build alignment, but a 100 to 200 foot corridor where that type of trail experience could fit into. We've got the basic links, we've got the construction style, and this allows us to develop a more detailed cost opinion and to start to consider phasing based upon access or based upon other needs within terms of the trail development strategy or approval strategy. And if you can note here, the different colored trails, they match up to different trail difficulties, which as we talk about trail types, we're also going to further break down those trail types into different difficulty levels. And this is part of creating that large spectrum and that progression of trails within a system. So really important as we're doing planning to understand your environmental and cultural resources, protection and compliance requirements. These can be deal breakers, like double, triple, quadruple the cost of your project and make it not viable. So it's a really good idea to understand what those are going to be, meet with as many of the ologists beforehand, biologists, archaeologists, and determine what their specific concerns are for that agency or that land manager. You may also want to be considering what your funding streams are going to be, because your funding streams are also going to partially determine your compliance requirements. If you're working on county land and you take federal dollars, you're going to have to do NEPA compliance. Whereas if you're working on county land and taking county dollars, you may not have to do NEPA compliance. So considering what those species of concerns, those areas of concerns are, and the map below shows the how the wetland areas were avoided during the trail design, because we know that was going to cause excessive permitting issues. Consider what it's going to cost to operate and maintain your trail system. You don't want to have a trail system that you don't have funds to operate. Capital costs are almost always easier to get than operational costs. And we've seen failed trail systems where people were overly aggressive and they got funding to build something really special, but didn't have the ability to maintain it afterwards. Better to be conservative and make sure you can have trails in good condition 10 years after they're built than to have a flash in the pan and have a failed trail system 5 years later. During the planning process, we're refining our costs. Here's both a generic cost opinion table and a more detailed one. You can see these are based on roughly on unit prices, and note the contingency that's in there, 20% contingency, because these were, this is master planning. These trails haven't been flagged on the ground. More importantly, the specific funding stream hasn't been determined, and the funding stream can have significant impacts on the construction cost. So that's why the contingency fee is in there. And note that all these numbers end in 3 zeros. They're big and round, they're fairly conservative, generally turned up rather than down, so that any grants that are applied for, there should be more money than needed rather than less money. In terms of finding the money, Have part of your team be focused on the fundraising, have a strategy for that, involve the funders in the project early on. One thing we learned at IMBA that was really effective: if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. If you can get your potential funders, especially this is really true if we're talking about large private donors, if you can get their hands dirty, get them involved in the planning process, helping make decisions, helping you solve problems, they're going to become bought into the project. They're going to take some ownership over that project, and then they're going to be that much more willing to help support it financially. And remember, this goes back to your brand. Think about the brand you were developing and the envisioning, and use that in your marketing. If you're going to target certain specific donors, figure out who's going to be the point of contacts for that, who's going to lead on that, and then really make sure you have a communications plan, what your talking points are, possibly a website that can be referred to, the elevator pitches. Make sure, because you're going to have a variety of people throughout the community reaching out to different folks. And we are a small state, 1 degree of separation. Everybody knows everybody else. And it's important that we have consistent messaging in the communications plan. So developing that and giving everybody the same talking points means that whoever they talk to in the community about the project, they're going to be saying the same thing. And that's going to speak well to funders. It's going to seem really well organized and really well supported. So a lot of sources for funding. One thing I'll say here, and we're not going to go too much in depth in this. My other compatriot at the OEDC is much more of an expert in the fundraising area. But almost always, if you're getting money from some source, that source will add some criteria to how you spend that money. Getting undesignated funding is really rare, especially if you're getting federal funding. There'll be probably 16 to 20 pages of criteria that you have to follow to disperse that funding. This can have significant impacts to your project cost. So it's really good to do a funding stream analysis to make sure that the funding you're applying for or chasing is actually going to be that you getting it awarded is one step. Actually dispersing it and using it for the project can be another step. And if you have a $100,000 project and you're awarded $100,000 and it costs you, and that makes the project then cost $150,000, well, you're now $50,000 in the hole. So it's important to do that funding stream analysis early on, and really turn over the stones, read the documents, read the grant applications, and determine what you're going to need to do to actually spend that money. The planning process, we're going to talk a little bit about design because most folks lump the two together. We do separate them a little bit. We consider the planning process to be about the trail experience, determining what the potential trail experience is and what the potential social outcomes are. Doing the planning well requires a good understanding of the desired experiences and the potential outcomes. The design is where we then take that plan and we match how do we create those experiences on that specific landscape. Doing the design well requires a strong understanding of construction. And specifically, one of the things we're talking about LWCF in West Virginia, to my understanding, purchases land acquisition. With the cost of trails these days and the low cost of land, it is often worth considering that you may not wish to be trapped in the land you have available as public land, but consider acquiring land that would be more suitable if you don't have the best land available. We have watched trail projects where they didn't consider land acquisition and they spent more on the trail to get around the awkward piece of private property than they could have just bought that piece of property for. And that's where the LWCF fund comes in. It's important to have the land to put the trails on. So as we get into the design part of it, the level of detail required, and we want to have enough detail to meet our compliance for regulatory and our procurement, and no more detail. These are two examples here. We've got one plan that looks like a plan set plan. This was used for a SWIP in Louisville, Kentucky. And then we've got another very crude map that was used for a RTP grant bid out to commercial construction in Virginia on Lookout Mountain. Both of those resulted in highly successful trail systems, but they didn't require the same level of plan detail. And that way the cost of the design was balanced to what was required to do the procurement or the permitting. It's also important during the design process, we go back to the plan to look at the trail experience that's intended for that trail corridor. And these are two example photos. They're both mountain bike trails. They're both on a hillside. Both riders are riding downhill on them, but they're very different experiences. We have a switch berm and a berm turn. They're for different styles of trail. One's for more of a flow style trail. One's for more of a single track style trail. And they wouldn't fit this. You couldn't put that berm turn on the hillside that the switch berm's on. And if you were to try and put that style of trail on that hillside, it would be incredibly challenging and possibly not feasible. So it's important during the design process that we understand what the details are of the experience requirements for that trail type, and we match that up with the plan. And we need to get inside the heads of the visitors that we're going to develop that experience for. Understanding the different needs of various modalities and various types of visitors and matching that up with the trail experience that's in the plan, that'll determine the specifications that we develop during the design process that'll then yield that experience to the visitors. Yep, you can definitely develop trails with different lifespans in mind. That would be a criteria that would want to be known during the planning process, because if a trail only has a 10 or 20-year lifespan, and then determining what's going to happen to the property after that, if it's going to have extraction occur on it and heavily change the top of the landscape, you may be significantly less concerned with sustainability during that time. Generally, I would say that most of the advice I'm going to give on trails is for trails that we intend to be there 100 years or 200 years from now. We're looking for stable alignments that are going to have longevity and have used techniques that we've pulled from old world trail systems that have a very long lifespan. So a little bit about, we're not going to go in depth on the different types of trail users because we just don't have enough time. That's for another presentation, but I will briefly cover different trail types. Shared use pathways, rail trails, gravel surface, shared use trails, natural surface, and these are optimized for everybody to play well together. So everybody gives up a little bit of their experience to work well on the shared use trails. These can be front country or back country. Generally in the front country, they're going to be the more easier and intermediate style trails, but really good attention to sight lines, really good attention to intersections. And generally, if we're going to do a shared use system, also going to recommend pockets of single use to allow for certain experiences that may not play well on shared use trails. Hiking trails, hiking only. We can do great things with hiking trails that we can't do with shared use trails. We can go places, push grades, hit unique landscapes. There's a very strong reason why to have hiking only trails. And different design criteria for hiking only trails than for shared use trails. ADA trails, these are trails that meet the ADA spec. However, they are not the only way to meet your mobility challenges, the needs for your visitors for mobility challenge. Mobility challenge comes in a large spectrum. All of us on this call, we have a wide degree of active mobility. Some of us are highly privileged and are very mobile. Other folks are not as mobile. And providing a progressive spectrum of difficulty in your trail system and then signing it well so people are informed about their options and can make good choices is one of the most effective things you can do to increase access for folks that have some of those mobility challenges. I would also encourage you that if you are one of those privileged people that's super active and super fit, that when you're evaluating trails, you take along with you someone who uses a walker or someone who's not quite as fit or not quite as nimble, and walk behind them and see how they interpret those features. Because a lot of times we unfortunately become blind to the obstacles that other people face. Motorized trails, to make a successful motorized trails, you follow most of the guidelines for sustainability with a few tweaks that you do for non-motorized. And this is we definitely need to consider this as the line between motorized and non-motorized continues to blur with technology advances. Bike optimized trails are simply trails that could be shared use or single use, but they've been designed and built in such a way that they work really well with the physics of a bike. Good turn radiuses, good sight lines, and that they provide a positive experience on a bicycle. But there's a huge spectrum from easiest to most difficult. And they could be bike only and gravity trails. That's a form of bike optimized, generally ridden downhill using gravity to propel you. And these again can be from easiest level up to most difficult. Oftentimes a good idea, especially in a front country area, in a larger shared use system, to provide some opportunity like this, so that you have a safety valve for riders who are looking for this. Snowshoe's been highly successful the last couple of years, and has taught a lot of people how to ride in a fashion that they wouldn't have known before, and they're now looking for those experiences in their hometowns. So if you're seeing jumps pop up on your shared use trail, that's probably some of your local riders voting for the fact they want a gravity trail. Bike parks, these are dense facilities where we can provide a lot of experience for a short amount of time. These are also things, the other thing about the gravity trails and the bike parks is they are not widely available. So they have a huge market demand and people will travel further for them. The more common a trail type is, the less people are willing to travel for it. The more unique it is, the longer people will go. And one of these pictures is from the rail yard in Bentonville. One of my coworkers went to Bentonville. Bentonville has a couple hundred miles of trail right now. They spent every afternoon in the bike park because that's where the entire family had options to ride. From the 5-year-old up to the experienced enthusiast dad. Everybody had opportunities in there. Full spectrum of progression. These also can fit in the small pocket areas. Generally, we like them hard surface if possible, to reduce maintenance and to provide a consistent experience. Water trails, mostly about identifying we're not creating trails here. We're identifying access points, distances, and providing really good information and wayfinding for folks about those put-ins and takeouts, and then ways for people to get good information online about the current river conditions so they can make choices. Because this is an area where the current condition of the water makes a difference whether the experience is viable or not. I'm not going to go into sustainability as much as I would in one of the other presentations. We're going to hit on it just a little bit, but we will talk about sustainability. Climbing trails. Climbing is a trail-oriented sport. They're vertical trails, and they need access trails, and they need trailheads. So it's important when we consider climbing areas that we consider some of the same stuff we do for larger trail systems. Where are people going to park? How are they going to get to the climbing area? How are we going to make that be a sustainable and not erosive impact on the environment? Also, the environmental compliance is really important, and the cultural, because climbing areas invariably seem to hit areas that have past cultural significance, and are areas that create unique microclimates. Sustainable trails. This is one slide on the really basics of how to prevent erosion with natural surface trails. Don't go down the fall line, follow the half rule. If that statement's confusing, check out one of the IMBA books, or look up the half rule online. What the half rule does is it allows you to have frequent grade reversals. This is the whole key. We want to keep water off the trail. And we want to stay out of low areas. We want to be up on the side slope whenever possible and use a rolling contour design. That's trails built following these principles and designed following these principles have a much greater chance of resisting erosion and being long lasting. If you're going straight down the hill and you've got a trail that channels water as much as people, you're playing the Army Corps' game, and few of us have the resources that the Army Corps has. So as we refine, this is about developing the specifications within your design that then allows whoever's going to build that trail, whether it be volunteers, agency staff, or professional contractor, to build a trail that meets the experience goals that were defined in the plan. So both the difficulty ratings, and then also you can see here a matrix that describes various aspects of that trail that could then be used in the construction to guide the builder. And this also allows us to refine our construction budget as well. And as we get into the design, we're probably going to adjust our phasing recommendations also. As much detail as you need and no more. The plan set you see above, heavy style plan set. Generally, those are driven by procurement requirements or permitting requirements, or just expectations by the people who administer the funds. They're typically used to looking at plan sets like that, so they feel more comfortable when they see a plan set that looks like that. However, we generally work towards a narrative or a prescriptive approach, where in this type of situation, you do this thing to these specifications rather than you will do exactly this at this exact point on the ground. Because this is really important with natural surface trail construction. It doesn't scale well to a fully grade staked build style. There's a lot of field fitting. Selecting a good operator and a good builder allows you to have them to have the freedom to make choices within a defined trail corridor or a defined build alignment based upon the experience, the specifications. They can make the choice of which side of the tree they're going to go on, or which side of the boulder outcropping. They can adjust the trail, adjust the grade a little bit here, make it up in another place. Find a place that's wet and has a seep that wasn't known about. Well, there's a rock armoring specification that they can go ahead and use and apply there. I really strongly want to avoid the idea that Europe has adopted, where everything is grade staked. And rather than going through a boulder, they decided to have to blow up the boulder because that's where the plan was approved and no one found the boulder there before the builder did. We want to give that flexibility that enables us to have better experiences and reduce our costs and reduce our environmental impact. Example of a RFP that was used to develop phase 1 of the Yonah Trails in Georgia. Unit price bid sheet, specifications for that, and the map that tells the contractor where they need to be. This is, we talked to, should we be phasing? Well, that was phase 1 of the Yonah project. Entry-level trails, getting the support of the land manager, getting the support of the local county. And then this was phase 3. More advanced trails, a little bit longer. When we're doing our phasing, there may be several reasons to do phasing. We may need to gain credibility with an adjacent land manager. We may need to develop capacity within the local community to assist with building the next trails. We may need to get support within the local community by building trails that can turn them into trail users, because currently the only trails they have are for enthusiasts. And we need to have larger support within the community to leverage the funds or the permission to move to the next step. Or we might need to access that part of the property that we don't have it until we build phase 1. Or we just need to, we may have one phase that really fits well with one funding stream. And then we have another phase that's going to work better for a different funding stream. Success breeds success. So sometimes it's necessary to get something on the ground and build the buzz before we can go ahead and get support for the second part, or the third part, or the fourth part, or the fifth part. It's there's also a benefit to phasing your project in that if you do it all at once, you'll get a lot of media buzz and a lot of support. But if you can take your time and add to your trail network year after year after year, there's always something new for people to come back to. People have come to your trail system, they've ridden it, they've loved it, they've hiked it, they liked it. Next year, there's new trails there and they want to come back and they bring their friends with them. And more people, and we've seen this growth curve comparing different trails, and ones that were developed over multi-year spans were more successful than ones that were developed all at once. There are a lot of mountain bike trail contractors and shared use trail contractors available. Risk management always comes up. Nothing's safe outside. That's why we built the built environment. The natural environment's risky. Don't say it's safe. These are some of the basic elements of risk management that were developed to allow us to build really challenging trails. If we make everything super safe and super easy, we take away a lot of the reason that people are out there in the trails. Edward Abbey had a great quote: "May your trails be long, twisty, winding, and dangerous." It's part of the thrill, part of the challenge that people have. And quite frankly, unless we fell every tree out there and level the land we're not going to make it truly safe for people. We don't want to set false expectations. That creates additional liability for us. Risk management's two parts. It's one, reducing the level of risk to the visitor, and two, protecting your financial assets. Two parts that go together. And signage is a key part about this. We put it in risk management because it's really important for that. Good wayfinding, informing people so they can make good choices, informing people so they can communicate their location if they have an accident. And while trail maps and apps like Mountain Bike Project or Hiking Project are very useful and really important to use, they're not a replacement for good signage on the ground. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Jeremy to talk about a live example of a successful planning project that's resulted in a great trail system.
Great, thank you, Rich. And as I get started here, Rich, give me a thumbs up if my microphone's better than it was earlier.
It's much better.
All right, thank you. And apologies for that earlier. So yeah, as Rich said, we're going to transition here. And next slide, Rich. We're going to talk about a trail system in one of your neighboring states to the west there, the Bailey's Trail System on Ohio. This is a great project that our team has been lucky to be part of, a large coalition of the community of folks that have worked on launching this project. Danny, one of Rich's compatriots there at WVU, was part of the start of the design phase of this project, and prior to that, the roots of this project as well, as he was a member of that Athens Bicycle Club that started this project with their federal land managing partner on this is the Wayne National Forest, the Athens District, and their roots of this project go back to the 90s. So this was a long, slow burn in terms of the local enthusiast mountain bike community wanted to develop additional trails in the area. About 2015, 2016, land was identified by the forest, about 12,000 acres, that they were willing to continue to have dialogue and move into kind of a more formal planning phase with that partner, the Athens Bicycle Club, or ABC. And that community of trail users engaged, sent out an RFP for professional design assistance. We responded to that, and in 2015, 2016 timeframe, design was undertaken and planning work was undertaken in about an 18-month period to 24 months. And during that process, and we'll talk more about this on the next couple slides, the partners increased. It wasn't just the Athens Bicycle Club, the contractor, and the forest. Additional lands were identified, as Rich talked about, some challenging property lines or access issues around that forest, 12,000 acres that was provided, needed to be addressed. And so those community members and neighboring landholders, both in terms of municipal lands and private lands, were engaged during the planning process early. And it led to a really successful project. And they're on their fourth year of trail construction there in 2022. They've got about 25 to 30 miles of trail on the ground right now. And they're building towards an 88-mile trail system, which is moved really quickly from design to implementation in terms of how we typically see federal projects and projects of this scale move. So next slide. As I mentioned, during the design phase, this started as a bike club and a Forest Service having a conversation about increasing trail opportunities. Quickly during the trail planning process, it was identified they have a greenway there, the Athens Hockhocking Adena Greenway, sealed surface old railroad trail that connects Nelsonville to Athens, to where the University of Ohio is, and connects over to some existing mountain bike facilities there. You can see on Stroud's Run and Sells Park just outside of Athens. The 12,000 acres, mostly shown in the green area there, that were identified, had some significant challenges to development for trails in terms of their abandoned mine lands. Prior to Forest Service ownership, timber operations, heavy timber operations in the early part of the 20th century totally denuded this area. So there's a lot of erosional issues, and the Forest Service actively burns to restore that forest now. And they're doing a great job with that. But that competing use and the need to accommodate trail design that allows for continued burn and forest restoration and operations while avoiding abandoned mine features. Many of your lands in West Virginia will have similar challenges. All of that was identified early in the planning process, as well as the want to connect additional communities that were relatively underserved. Athens has the university; it's doing quite well. but Chansey and Buchtel and Doneville, some of these neighboring small communities that used to be thriving, booming towns when mining was active and timber was active, were in need of, or are in need of benefits beyond economic, health benefits for the local community as well, and access to the forest for active recreation. So these were some of the maps that were used in that community engagement. The communities of the two counties, Nelson County and Athens County, as well as the communities from each of these towns were engaged. And to be honest, the smaller towns and the more isolated towns, Buchtel, Doneville, and Chansey were, I think, relatively skeptical in the beginning of this process of the enthusiast mountain bike club and the forest wanting to come in and do their thing. But through a balanced planning process and really sitting and listening with those communities, as Rich said, engaging with them, not going to them asking for funding, but asking for them for input and advice on this trail system, really led to the success of this project as it moved to that fundraising phase. And now as they're moving through implementation, continuing to hold the promises that were made to those communities true, and has led to continued success and continued attraction of funding and for implementation on this. So next slide. So during this process, there were two counties, multiple municipalities, and the National Forest, as well as several user communities that were engaged. This Outdoor Recreation Council of Appalachian, or ORCA, was created through this process. They are now a fiscal operator in this. They handle a lot of the grant funds for implementation phases here in close collaboration with the Forest Service and the partners. And they're also, as Rich mentioned, they're doing the branding work and the marketing. And on the next slide, we'll see some of their work in that space. But the map on the left here, this is a kiosk map from this year. This shows the first 3 phases of trail that have been completed. And it also shows future trail that's going to be completed in the next 2 phases. Phase 4, the funding on this project went from funding about 11 miles of trail in the first phase, which provided a community connection to Chansey and started to redevelop their park as a trailhead. And we'll look at what that trail looks like here in a second. It was more of that accessible trail as Rich went through the trail types. This was closer to an ADA accessible trail. It's surfaced for all weather use. It was meant to be really approachable for that community and demonstrate that commitment to providing diverse and quality outdoor recreation for that community to become engaged in. That park in that town was the one we used for a lot of our planning meetings and for a lot of our field work. And we went from, in 2015, 2016, we went from picking up all sorts of trash, including needles. There's a big opioid crisis, as you all know, that spills over into Ohio as well. But we went from cleaning up needles and really being careful where we parked and how we moved around that park and seeing kind of unwanted use in the park in 2015, 2016. And now that that's the trailhead, we're seeing thriving trail activity and regional draw, as well as local community members fixing up those bikes that were sitting next to their houses, bikes that us enthusiasts in the space would never consider riding. We're seeing a lot of those bikes out on the trails and community members becoming members of small trail running groups and hosting and organizing events there. And ORCA and the partners there are coordinating all of that. Next slide. And so this is on the Bailey's website. They've done a great job with their branding and marketing of these trails. This has all happened in the last couple years, starting in phase 2, phase 3. They launched this website. ORCA has some staff that are dedicated to social media and collecting information and sharing it through the partnership. But you can see on here 3 different types of trail. These were all built in phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 was 11 miles of trail, as I mentioned. Phase 2, we added 5 miles of trail. The Bullfrog Loop there was in phase 2. The other trails on the screen were in phase 1. That Chansey Depot Trail illustrates that community connection and kind of a trail that is not for the enthusiasts. It's a gateway trail, and it connects further onto the landscape. Enthusiasts use it to get out of the trailhead and onto the broader system, including the Coltrane trail that's shown there. But really the first 2 phases focused on that low end, accessible community development trail and connecting that community and Doneville to this larger landscape. The Bullfrog Loop was built by IMBA Trail Solutions. The Chansey Depot Trail was built by a West Virginia contractor, Appalachian Dirt, based out of the Davis-Elkins area. And Coltrane was built by another regional builder out of North Carolina. Next slide. So this is, an example of a, I know I didn't go into too much depth there, but an example of a community that came together with a pretty narrow focus, a mountain bike focused project working with the Forest Service. And through good planning, they really engaged that broader community. As such, they were able to attract funding from the National Forest Foundation, which funded qualified quantified ventures to explore a pilot funding program for this. The first 3 phases were funded at relatively small amounts. They built 11 miles of trail the first year, which was great. The following 2 years were about 5 miles of trail each. Next year in phase 4 in 2022, they've got funding from a state funding combined with some federal funding, and they're going to fund about 40 to 50 miles of trail to be constructed next summer on the project. They utilized a IDIQ process to qualify bidders and builders, contractors from around the region. They have about 10 contractors that are qualified to do that work. And they've gone back to that pool year after year as funding comes in to do that implementation. They've kept the design team in place to assist with construction management and construction support to those builders. And I think that's been a key to helping keep things on. But I can't overstate how influential and how key community members and their broad outreach were in the beginning. The review process for environmental and cultural review, as Rich was alluding to, especially around climbing areas and cliffs and needing those cultural resources and environmental resources, that went at a pace that frankly shocked our team and I think a lot of folks in the trail community and trails professional community around the world. To have a 12,000 acres and 88 miles of trail move through the Forest Service federal NEPA review process in about 6 months is pretty unheard of. But the engagement with the forest early on, they brought out all their ologists, they identified areas they needed to avoid or wanted to avoid or minimize impact on. And they brought out the private neighbors that were gonna voice opinions about not wanting use in their backyard. They identified a lot of those issues early, and through the planning process, concessions were made that are usually done through a long drawn out NEPA public process. And so setting that up and engaging broadly really led to the success of this trail project. Next slide. So that was an example of this Bailey's project, as I just mentioned, was pretty quick from getting started on design to now phase 4 of implementation. They certainly skirted a lot of pitfalls and missteps in that process. And they did it smoothly, and they did it well because they had a large community and coalition that they had built around this project, and it wasn't just single use or brought in, kind of helicoptered in and planned for them and then implemented. That broad community engagement helped them in a lot of ways move pretty quickly. We do see projects that want to move really fast, and about the only place you can do that successfully is going to be on private land with private dollars. As Rich said, when you start engaging public lands, there's a lot of review and process that has to go on. If you're using federal or state dollars, there's a lot of bureaucracy attached to that. And a good planning process will help you navigate around those hiccups and hurdles. And while it might not seem like the straightest line often from, hey, we've got money, we've got folks that can do this, let's implement, spending the time to do proper planning and subsequent design and construction will really get you there quicker, and it'll lead to a much more high quality trail in the end, and trail system that'll meet the goals of the partners, which may and often should involve regional tourism, economic development, and health benefit development for communities and jobs as well. So I would say, in terms of these pitfalls, a lot of folks step into them. We step into them on projects with our professional planning efforts. They should be things you're looking out for and navigating, but don't let a few bumps in the road, shut you down or steer you away from a planning process, and engage outside entities when you need to. I think Rich is going to share here in a couple minutes some of those resources that are available in the area, but folks like Rich at the WVU OEDC and his compatriots have a lot of resources and skills they can bring to bear and help you navigate these waters, as do a lot of your community members as well, and folks from Rails to Trail organization and others will be able to help you navigate this quite well. Next slide. I think we're back to you, Rich.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So yeah, if folks are interested in additional education about trail planning, the Davis College of West Virginia University is offering a Sustainable Trails Development undergraduate and graduate certificate. You can Google WVU Sustainable Trails and it'll pop up. Secondly, in terms of getting planning, and this is specifically for natural surface trails on larger landscapes, not on predefined corridors as much, such as rail trails. But if you're going to explore a larger landscape, these are all firms that have experience working in the Eastern US and the Appalachians, have experience collaborating with engineering firms, depending upon what plan sets need to be produced for procurement or regulation compliance. And they're all very experienced in developing shared use systems with pockets of single use. And Inba Trail Solutions, Applied Trails Research, C2 Recreation, KLIN, Community Trail Designs. There's more folks out there, but this is what I would consider the cream of the crop, folks that I would be comfortable handing any project that I felt important enough that I would hand off to. If there's a good resource for planning assistance. If you're looking for contractors, check out trailbuilders.org. That's the website of the Professional Trail Builders Association, which is an industry group of trail contractors. Many of them who work in the East, you can look at their map source and it'll show you the location. And you're going to find folks there who might be able to help you with the contracting as well. I work for the Brad and Elise Smith Outdoor Economic Development Collaborative. We're a new department in the provost office in WVU, and we focus on youth initiative around outdoor recreation and on developing the outdoor economy in West Virginia. And we do that through a variety of ways. I'm focused on the lower part of the slide. Project development and management, technical assistance, education and training. And we'll provide technical assistance in a variety of ways. If it's a small project, we may help you direct with the design and planning. We can always help with strategizing about projects. I believe my phone number's in the conference, or my contact information is in the conference details. You can reach out to me, send me an email. Be glad to talk about any opportunities. I don't know, I've met a lot of people in West Virginia over the last 6 months, but I don't know nearly enough folks or nearly enough about what's going on in the state. And if your needs are more than our capacity can provide, we're going to help you find the resources you need, whether that's through helping develop RFPs or RFQs to get planning firms, to help you develop that for construction, to help strategize about funding. We may assist with grant writing. Jeremy mentioned the Fayette Trails Coalition. We helped sponsor that trail planning project and then did technical assistance during that trail planning project. And now that's one of my coworkers is down in Fayetteville this week discussing some funding opportunities that have become available that were starting to be developed even before the trail planning process was over. Secondly, we're doing a lot of education and training, building capacity. We don't want to do things for people. We want to assist folks. We want to help communities be empowered to make the best trails and outdoor recreation opportunities that you can. With that, look forward to an announcement over the next couple of months about a series of workshops that we're hoping to do next year. Similar to Inba Trail Care Crew, where we'll be going into communities and helping get folks to network together about trails and then share some knowledge about basic trail building and development. Use the trail building workshops as an opportunity to bring everybody together. If you want to have the good outcomes from trails, not just have trails, but have really quality trails that really help improve your community, bring new people to your community, bring the people who are in your community out to the outdoors, good planning is critical for that. It's easy to get trails. It's much harder to get trails that are really effective in having the desirable social and land management outcomes. Secondly, if you need help, give us a call. There's a variety of different ways we can do that. Our dream is West Virginia that is known as a place for outdoor recreation. The kids who grew up in Colorado dream about moving to West Virginia because we're the place to be, because that's where all the cool trails are. That's where the best whitewater is. That's where the best climbing is. We're well on the road to becoming that place, and we can definitely be that place. And everything I've seen with the folks I've met around the state and the energy from this conference makes me think that that dream is completely real. So thank you very much for everything you've done so far and everything you're going to do in the future. Got a little bit of time for questions. I prefer, Laura, I'm gonna hang on to that for just a second. Ella, I'm gonna ask your question about using federal funds for, and the requirements for bidding. Several of the documents we showed in the presentation were based on bidding out RTP funds on natural surface trail projects. One of those was RTP funded in Georgia, the Yona Trail project. Another one was North River Trail enhancements that with the Shenandoah Valley Bicycle Coalition over in Virginia. Currently, right now, IMBA Trail Solutions and Capon State Park are working under an RTP grant for installing a trail next year. And then other projects that I know of that were funded with, are partially funded with RTP funds or federal funds that were bid out: Raystown, Alley Grippus Trails, Wood Run Trails in North Carolina, Uwharries, North Carolina, Coldwater Mountain in Alabama. Jeremy, you may know some as well. But there's definitely, that's one of the reasons we've worked with the unit price model and good specifications, is it allows us to do apples to apples bidding in a way that meets federal requirements, both from an RTP perspective and a US Forest Service perspective, but still allows us the flexibility to field fit things on the ground and to keep the planning and design costs light and in scale with what natural surface trails cost. Because for natural surface trails, an expensive natural surface trail is $80,000 a mile, whereas an expensive rail trail might be $1 million to $1.5 million a mile. I'm gonna scroll back down through the, whoa, lots of questions. Okay. Your trail planning documents, you're going to want to have published documents. You're going to want to have people agree to stuff, but you should revisit them, especially if you're in a long-term trail planning or trail development process, multi-year or a decade long. You want to have those to be a living document, because your initial trail plan and your initial successes with trail implementations are surely going to yield more people and more entities that want to be involved in part of that. So you're going to want to have the flexibility to add that stuff in there later. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah. Oh, no, yeah, it's not just economic opportunity. The reason I've done trails for years, the economic push has been somewhat more recent, but one of the big benefits we see is if you want to protect open space, get the public on it. Open space that doesn't have advocates, we live in a democracy, and a lot of our public open space is paid through by tax dollars. Or through land trusts that generate funds from the public. And if the general population aren't trail users and don't see the value of that open space, they're not going to want to protect it. And we know that by building compelling trails, and this is one of the reasons to build good quality trails, is we can take people who don't feel like they're conservationists. They're just athletes. They want exercise. And we can put them on a compelling trail in a natural space. We can transfer their love from that trail experience to the natural space and turn them into passionate defenders of this. Great example, Fantasy Island, Tucson, Arizona, state land. Most of the state land in Arizona is intended to be sold to fund their education department. That's why they have it, is to sell it off to developers. Fantasy Island was an undeveloped spot. Local community developed trails on it. Real estate was developed all around it. The property value got to the point where it was ready for the state to be sold. Instead, it got turned into a park because of the active trail use on it, created a bunch of advocates to protect that open space. So yeah, trails can be an important conservation tool.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, the question, Vincenzo, you had asked about trails as conservation, and I think that's one of the things where we've seen some success regionally. There's a project in Pennsylvania that got over $400,000 for environmental restoration work that's being used to redevelop trail systems and eliminate stream crossings and undo like fall line trail sections that are having point source impacts to water resources. So they're doing a watershed restoration grant that they're using. 95% of the funds are going into redeveloping a trail system to eliminate those impacts. So that's another way to frame with some of these projects, is to look at the needs of the landscape and frame them as conservation, health benefits, economic benefits. It's not just about getting more enthusiasts on the trails. It's about making the system better and addressing issues.
And from a land management perspective, especially if you have fragile areas or important resources that really shouldn't have the public near them, trails are your most cost-effective visitor management tool. If you do trails well and you plan them well, you can direct people to where the land has the carrying capacity for that public visitation and away from those areas that are more fragile. Saw really nice work done out west, petroglyphs, big issue. And deliberately taking the trail by low value areas so that people would have the experience of seeing petroglyphs, but keeping the trail away from the really high value arc sites, that aren't that far away, but because people are being exposed to stuff, it's satisfying their need to see that, and they don't feel like they need to go explore and possibly stumble across the areas that haven't had the arc work done on them. Tracy, in terms of the pros and cons of different trail design concepts, you're definitely thinking about the right stuff. Hub systems, stacked loops, those are both ways to provide progression and choices for people. And you're thinking about phasing in a trail plan. However, the determination of which of those is preferred of those different choices is going to be largely contextual based upon the specific, that system, that park. And this is the case with a lot of things in trails. We have some basic guiding principles that we work with, but a lot of this is dependent upon the landscape and that community setting and where they're at. Like if you may choose to begin with your easy trails because you want to build community support, or because you don't have a lot of trail visitors in that community and you want to get them experienced, so you do good risk management before you build the more challenging trails. Your phasing may be somewhat seasonally dependent because your procurement got bogged down with various, for whatever reason, and you couldn't get started at a certain time. So you may choose to build, and this is more of a Western thing, but you may choose to build based upon your elevation or upon your aspect. I think we see a future of a lot of shared use systems. Generally, I prefer the word shared use to multi-use. Multiple use in federal land speak means big, heavy equipment and extraction. Shared use encourages everybody to play well together, but shared use systems with pockets of single use, where you may have, a mountain bike specific gravity trail is not going to be very desirable to trail run or hike on, but it's going to provide an important opportunity for those riders so that they're not trying to obtain that opportunity on a shared use trail, or worse, they're out illegally building a non-system trail and possibly having impact on resources because it was an unmanaged system. So a variety of different trail experiences. And that's again why you may have specific hiking trails, especially in a more populated trail system that's going to provide people certain isolation, that sense of privacy they want. That question was in response to, you see trails going away from multi-use trails to specific use, mountain biking and new trail construction. Hikers and backpackers don't like the berms and humps that bikers do.
And Rich, there's another question in the Q&A. Owen asks, what's WVU OEDC's current interpretation of the Land and Water Conservation Fund program and using funds to build trails? Historically, these have not been allowed to be used for trail building. Has OEDC commented on the SCORP? So kind of a policy recommendation.
Owen, sounds like we should talk about that. It is my understanding that LWCF funds in West Virginia, unlike in other states, are limited specifically to land acquisition. Other states have definitely used them for trail development, but West Virginia, it seems like we're still, and I'm not the fundraising specialist in the OEDC, very much more the implementation. Someone else gets the money. I help figure out how to people to spend it wisely. But there are situations, and I touched on this earlier, where sometimes we get trapped in the land that currently seems to be available in public hands. And sometimes we make really expensive decisions about trail construction and the style of trail we build based upon those artificial limits we put in. And given if you notice the Kakapen trail cost estimate, it's $3.5 million estimate for 34 miles of trail. Well, if part of that is based upon certain property line restrictions, having to build a big bridge or a large retaining wall to get around a difficult property corner, you might easily find it's easier to buy that adjacent property cheaper than it is to build that trail structure. So that's something that we've definitely, something that's changed in the last 5 years is that now during the planning process, we're much more likely to look at potential land acquisition as a solution to a boundary issue versus just accepting what's already there. Because it's one of the lessons that's been driven home is access and location is really important to the long-term success. And if we have to spend $250,000 to get the right piece of property or $5 million to get the right piece of property to put the trails on, well, that's probably worthwhile in the long run. And that's where the LWCF funding and the fact that it's fully funded for the first time ever is a big deal and can be really useful to us in West Virginia. Even if we can't directly spend it on the trails, we can buy the land and put the trails on, buy the canvas.
And Laura had asked a question about what format are trail plans best? Should they be a living document or a published manuscript? I'll take a quick stab at answering that, and then Rich, if you want to backstop me. I think very much these documents are living documents. We always get asked, and we always are pushing to try and develop a phased implementation plan. On the hundreds of projects that we've worked on, I don't think I've seen one that phase one was actually what was phase one in the plan. The funding amounts, as Rich mentioned, come with strings that are attached. Things get adjusted. If the permitting or environmental compliance work is still going on as projects are developing funds and moving forward, those often can change or shape priorities or even feasibility of portions of these plans. So having it as a living document and having it be readily accessible in multiple forms is very important. As Rich said, sometimes you're making an elevator speech to a politician and you need that glossy one pager. You need to be able to get that in front of them, have them look at it and understand what exactly is being talked about. And then on the other end, you may be talking to a permitting office and you need that super technical map and diagram that shows the same trail with 6 different underlayments of soil type and hydrology and erosion class of soil, because you're working with those in a different context. And having that published as just one giant tome out there doesn't really make it super accessible for everyone. So you need a group that understands the context in which they're working and then use that as a living document to guide the process and update as needed.
Very much agree with Jeremy. Not a fan of bookshelf plans. Plans, the value of a plan should be directly measured by how effective it was in implementing the trail system. Plans that don't result in implementation are worthless plans, wasted money. And that's living documents are much more successful at that. You may need to at times have people sign off and lock a plan in so that for say a NEPA approval or say a city council approval, but be ready to have iterations and then go back to that same entity and get approval for modifications. And yeah, as Jeremy mentioned, stuff changes. I didn't put this slide in there, but I had a slide that showed like a conceptual plan of the same trail system and then the actual design. And you can notice how the trail corridors modified. That during the design process, the experience objectives stayed the same, but during the design process, a lot of the unknowns were cleared up about the landscape and the trail corridors or alignments moved around and shifted, and iterative changes were made that resulted in a better meeting the desired experience goals in a better and less costly fashion than the original. The original concept plan painted those goals, had some lines there. The master plan took it a little further, but during the design process, we made sure that what was going to be on the ground really met those experience goals. And that meant the plans and the lines drawn on the map looked a bit different. And that's very common. If your concept plan lines, your build lines end up looking exactly like your concept plan lines did, either you had a really simplistic landscape and you did an amazing job on the concept, or you probably shortchanged yourself and your build may not have had the best alignment it could have.
Yeah. And I'll just, while we're talking about plans, I'll add that, having a plan in place, you're not going to know where all your funding is going to come from. But going through the planning effort is worth it. In that I've been working in this trail space since early mid 2000s, like 2005. And twice since then, we've had huge federal dollars thrown at projects, and forests and partners that had a plan in hand were able to say, hey, let's go after that ARRA money. Let's go after that GAOA funding. So the Great American Outdoors Act was the one that was most recently launched. And we have forest partners on 13, 14 different projects that we worked on in the last 5 years that were able to ask for funding for something they had a plan on the shelf because they had done the work. They had done the planning work. That's happened twice since I've been doing this over the last 15, 20 years. That will continue to happen. And so even if these big numbers like $3.5 million for Trail of Cape Capen, those can be scary. And a volunteer group's like, well, we could do this ourselves. Having a plan and having that be out there for when those opportunities come along will help you, and you'll be miles ahead of your competitor next door in terms of park or land management. If you have that plan and they don't, you'll be able to jump on it and they won't.
Nathan, cut us off if you need to, but I'd love to
Hey,
respond.
I'm just jumping in here. Yep. So it's 10:20 and that is the end of your session. But there's opportunities in the Whova app to reach out to Jeremy and Rich here. So thank you, Jeremy and Rich. And plenty of other support that happens around the state. But really focusing, I enjoyed the focus on communicating your ideas and planning as a process. So in the afternoon sessions, or the later sessions today, we're gonna have 2 workshops. One's gonna be about communicating impact of trails, and the other one is about working with private landowners. And then finally, we're gonna wrap up the day with networking, geographic networking meetings. Same thing we did yesterday, just around different geographies of the state. And I was very vague about the map of West Virginia here. So whatever your affinity is, there's some border counties that I included in there between southern West Virginia and the New River Gorge area. And I kind of lumped together Appalachia and the Eastern Panhandle, and the Ohio River Valley and Northern West Virginia. So just pick your group. And if you don't like that group, switch to another one. It's pretty easy. But thanks everyone for attending this one. We'll see you in about 10 minutes or so.